Okay, here we go. So the webinar account actually is a separate sort of component to Antioch's overall Zoom account. Uh, you can't just click something from your meeting and hold a webinar instead, although you can take a meeting and do some things to it to make it more webinar-like. Um, but as far as the webinar account goes, procedure is typically that you would contact me, or you could submit a help desk ticket and say, hey, I need a webinar. And things that I'm going to ask you are things like, okay, when? I need a time, I need a date. What's the topic? Is there a title to this thing? Because generic webinar, it doesn't generally work for a title. Um, Other things that are factors is, okay, who's going to need to be like a co-host? Who's going to need to be like an outside person who comes in and is part of part of the webinar as a panelist. Now, the terminology is a bit different with webinars too. You have panelists, you have co-hosts, you have yeah. Then rather than just like with this, you have participants. There, it's called something else. But when we're talking about the general audience of a webinar, they do not get a camera. They do not get to talk. They are there to listen and to watch. That is the basic settings going in. You can enable people to talk temporarily. There is a way to do that. There is also a way that you can allow people to use their cameras, but you have to promote them to panelists before they can actually do that. As far as the panelists go, they can share screen. They can do everything that a typical participant in a meeting can do. The co-host is what you would think. It's the person who has control over most everything except for, I think, one or two features, like if you wanted to do like a Facebook broadcast while you're doing the webinar at the same time, or if you're doing a YouTube stream while you're streaming the webinar while you're doing it, then only the host can do that. The co-host can't do that. That's like the one power. It's like with break rooms in meetings. It's the one thing that that only the host can do. People, as far as things that people will generally do, you can have polls just as you can in meetings. You can screen share. A lot of the controls look very similar to what you would have in a meeting. Additional things that you would have what's called a Q&A. It's a question and answer section. I'm going to show you some screenshots here in a moment of that. And a lot of people were wondering, well, can you do breakout rooms in meetings? No, you cannot do breakout rooms. That's a feature that I kind of would like to see at some point in the future. But at this, at the present time, the way that those work, you cannot have breakout rooms with webinars. Webinar length, basically, if you're going to schedule an hour for everything, anticipate that you're going to take more than an hour. Anticipate that you're going to take probably 5-10 minutes past the top of the hour. Inevitably, as these things go, and Terry will tell you, as you get to the top of the hour and try to wrap up, if things are going well and you have a whole lot of questions coming in the Q&A and so forth, if you've got a lot of panelists who are giving presentations, then you're going to have a lot more conversation, and that's going to drag past the top of the hour. There's no problem with scheduling something to go an hour and a half if you want to. Typical time is 1 hour. If you don't say anything, I'll schedule you for an hour. But yeah, if you want to do 1 hour and a half, I wouldn't recommend going 2 hours without some sort of break built in. of some kind because, well, people have to take care of bodily functions and beverages, and you get a little bit of eye strain going if you've been staring at a screen for too long.
So Harold, it sounds to me like the features that it has and doesn't have are basically because webinars tend to be much larger events
Mhm.
with one or more panelists and many, many, many participants. And so it would be hard to manage everybody's mic individually if you had 100 people online or 300 people online or 500 people online. Same thing with managing everybody's video. Not only that, the network strain might be a problem.
From my past experience in the chancellor's office with their addresses to the community, they eventually switched to, we have a large meeting account as well, and that can host up to 500 people, and it's in this particular format, the meeting format that we're using now. And yeah, uh, basically my job during that particular broadcast is to sit there and watch and see who unmutes themselves. Because if someone's unmuting themselves and making too much noise, then I gotta hit the mute button. Also, screen sharing is an issue. We figured out during one broadcast that screen sharing in that large meeting was problematic because someone decided right in the middle that they had to screen share their departmental information from a spreadsheet of some kind. Right over top the chancellor. That was fun. So we're scrambling to turn that off. But yeah, that was
Do you
hijinks.
have the security shield menu that you have in Google in meetings now? Do you also have that in the webinar down on your bottom toolbar where you can turn off chat, turn off screen sharing, turn off those sorts of things?
Well, let me show you what you have. That would probably be better. And I'm going to do this quick screen share here. This is typically what you get, and now you don't get my big ugly mug every time. But, yeah. Had the camera turned off at the moment. But when you're running a webinar like this, or if you're a co-host, then basic things you're going to see before you start the broadcast. And that's another point as well, is that if you have a webinar that's going to start, say, at noon, what I always recommend to people is come in at least 15 minutes early. If you're a veteran like Terry there, you can get away with 10 minutes early. But typically I say 15 to 20 minutes early. If you've never ever done a webinar before and you have a critical role, you might even want to show up 20 to 30 minutes early. And what that allows you to do is kind of sit there, go over the script one last time. And the more complex the webinar is, the more sophisticated the script has to be. I mean, if it's a simple webinar, it's basically just, okay, someone's going to introduce somebody, that person's going to give their presentation, we'll do a Q&A at the end. Then there's not a whole lot of scripting there. But if you have like multiple presenters and maybe a short video clip of some kind, other things going on, polls that need to be launched and taken down, then that script starts to resemble a real script, meaning a page or maybe even two of who does what and when they do it. But yeah, you get pre-webinar meeting is an absolute, just to make sure that, like I said, you go over the script, you go over hardware, make sure the hardware is working, make sure the screen sharing is working one last time so that everyone's clear on what it is that they're doing. That's another point. When you're talking about who does what in a webinar, you're going to have someone who's the master of ceremonies, someone who makes sure that they, who introduces the presenters, someone who talks about a video that may be coming up, or other conversation that might be taking place, between the panelists. They're the person who moderates everything. You're going to have another person who's basically there for just technical assistance. When you talk about webinars, and let's show you a different one here. With a webinar, you're going to have the chat feature, and then you're also going to have the Q&A feature. And this is a shot more or less of what the Q&A looks like before you start asking questions. There's the Q&A button. You'll notice that you don't have that security button. You'd asked about that, Bonnie. That's not down there.
So the Q&A allows you to have participants put questions for the panelists in it, but their comments on the ongoing flow of conversation can stay in the chat. So that way it wouldn't be, someone doesn't have to dig through the chat to find the questions for the panelists.
That's correct. That's one of the things that I always tell people is if you have things that are relevant to what the presenter is talking about, questions about that, about the topic, then those go in the Q&A. If you have technical issues, things that are not related to anything in particular, like I want to say hi to the panelists, that goes in the chat. And typically what you'll have is someone who is kind of the person who sort of wrangles all of that. Inevitably, you'll have that person who decides that they have to type their question in the chat, and it really should have went in the Q&A. And so, that person can redirect that, individual, hey, that's a good question. Can you put it in the Q&A? The technical person will sit there and, look for things like I can't hear the presenter, I can't see the presenter, or whatever other issues they might have and still be connected to the webinar. And then they'll help that person troubleshoot.
So presumably the person who contacts you about the webinar, they're going to provide the panelists and the main speaker. Do you perform the technical role, or are they supposed to they need to find someone to manage the chat and to manage the Q&A and have them come to the webinar too?
I've actually had it done a couple different ways as far as the chat goes. I've had a person who was just the master of ceremonies, and then I've had a person who monitored the chat looking for those questions that need to be in the Q&A and so forth. And I've basically sat there and just waited for things where people are having technical issues, and that's all I do. I've also been the person who does both those roles. I'm, redirecting people and then also answering technical questions at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
You generally don't want to have the master of ceremony also monitoring the chat unless you have to, because that gets to be too many balls juggling at once.
I mean, yeah,
I
do workshops every day, and I can't keep up with the chat. I literally have to stop and say, hey guys, give me a minute while I look and see if there's anything in the chat that I need to answer, and it sort of disrupts the flow a little bit.
Right, because when you're talking about webinars, you're talking about events that could typically have 30, 50, 80, 150, 250. I'm trying to think, remember the largest crowd we had. It was close to 400, I think. So yeah, in that kind of environment, chat's going pretty well. That's the other thing too with chat, is that you are, it's going to roll by quicker or slower depending upon who's, how many people are in there. But then also with chat, you can limit what goes on as far as what kinds of things can be said in there. For example, participants, you can set it so that participants can only talk to the panelists and to the host and co-host. You can have it set so that participants can only ask questions out in the open. Or you can have it so that they can ask questions to everybody at all times. And send direct messages to people and all of that. What I generally recommend, unless you have some need for people to be able to talk to each other in the chat, have the participants talking back and forth to each other, restrict that so that they can only talk to the panelists. That way, if they want to compliment the panelists on what a wonderful job they're doing, or the presenter on what a wonderful job they're doing, they can still do that. They can ask technical questions, but you don't have a lot of, scroll going on. The larger the crowd, the more you want to lock down that chat. And let's see.
Harold, one thing.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to put in there, since you've got the Q&A open on the screen, is
Yes.
one thing that we discovered is that panelists can all access the Q&A to read the questions, but they cannot submit a question themselves. So that's restricted only to the participants. And that's just come up a few times when we've had multiple panelists that have wanted to put a question into the queue for the Q&A, or if a participant posts something in the chat, I can't go in and post it myself in the Q&A. I have to tell them how to do it because I don't have that access on the panelist side.
Correct. I think one of the workarounds you can do is you can have a person who is a panelist, if they want to put a question in the Q&A, is send a private message to the person who's monitoring the Q&A. Hey, I'd like to put in a question if you don't mind. Ask the question, and then the person who's monitoring the Q&A, typically they're going to be pulling those questions out and asking the presenter, at the appropriate time, is that they can then pull that question out and say, oh, okay, yeah, we had a question about so-and-so, and then.
So I have a question. Terry, what role were you in? There's the role of the panelist and there's the role of the participant. Is there not a role of, say, co-host or something where they have access to do all of those things, Harold?
Well, yeah, there's
Yeah, I was the role of the co-host, but the person that wanted to put the question in was a role as a panelist, and neither one of us could access the Q&A to put in a question in that way. So we did use the chat. We sent a chat message to the moderator, but a lot of times the moderator, if there's a lot of chat going on, they're not too focused on the chat. They're mostly focused on the Q&A. So it's always iffy whether they're going to see a question there or not. So usually I just redirect people, the participants themselves, to put the question in. It's just we had a panelist that wanted to put a question in, and that was something new that we hadn't had before.
So maybe we need to send some feedback to Zoom about adding the security toolbar to security shield to the toolbar and giving co-hosts and panelists the ability to add things to Q&A. It's probably not as high priority as making sure Zoom meetings are working, but I think you get those and they have made changes.
Yeah. Okay. Recordings work the way they do in meetings. You can record to the cloud. You can also record locally. What a lot of people like to do is record to the cloud and to to their local computer. That way, if you want to post that up later, you don't have to say, hey, Harold, could you send me a copy of that video? And then, although I'm willing to do that, that's not a problem at all.
Yeah, like I'm going to do today.
Well, yeah.
Right. I didn't realize when I first started on these that when we record to the cloud, I can't access that myself. I have to get that from Harold. So that's why I usually have him record to the cloud to make sure that we have a good recording in case something happens, because I have had some issues recording locally. But then I'll record locally so that I can access that recording right away to do whatever I want to do with it. But then I always know Harold's got a backup for me in the cloud if I need it.
Yeah, right. And the only one that you can get a transcript for is the one that's in the cloud. So when you download to your computer, when you record to your computer, you can't get a transcript or you don't get the chat that can go side by side. But when Harold records to the cloud, if the transcript and chat are turned on, those are available to download as well, so that you can make them a closed caption thing on YouTube and really ramp up the accessibility of that video.
Yeah, we've started having requests too from participants to have live captioning available.
Hmm.
So that's something that I've been looking into to see how we can make that happen. But
So
just so
you'll
you know,
see he's got the closed captioning on there, and you can assign a person to type it. So if you had a work study student or anybody who would type along, every time they hit return, a new closed caption line becomes available, and people can choose whether to turn that on or not. Harold, is interpretation available in a webinar? We have in Zoom meetings the ability to turn on an interpretation channel, so you can assign someone to be translating to Spanish and translating to Chinese and translating to Urdu or whatever. And then the participants can choose which channel to be listening to. I imagine with a webinar that would be more necessary than with meetings, but it might have to be turned on in the settings to be able to do that.
That's not something that's ever come up as a request, but yeah, I mean, we'll take a look at the webinar settings here in a moment too, as what's possible and not possible. Let's see, we'll close that one. And yeah, just to kind of show you with the Q&A, you can actually change the settings if you want. You can allow anonymous questions. And you can allow attendees to actually view the, if they want to allow, they'll view all the questions or only the ones that have been answered. You at least want to allow them to view the ones that are answered because, well, that way they avoid asking the same questions over and over, as does happen on occasion. And let's see. Yeah, next thing we'll show here, hopefully, if all goes well, yes. So I have the special webinars thing here. And I say special because when I click webinars, I get to see all of this. And we'll show you what we're talking about here. All the scheduled webinars. And in some cases, what I do is I set up a webinar that's going to be like a practice session that doesn't really have a fixed time, especially if you're dealing with a series of webinars and everybody wants to have a practice session prior to. That's what we did with the In Bloom sessions. So I just had one practice session, and then whenever they needed to do a practice prior to one of the sessions, I would say, here's the link, everyone meet here, and that seemed to work pretty well. I'll go into this one. It's a mural project in Seattle. Unfortunately, it's invitation only. I'd invite you, but.
So the individual webinars have a lot of their own settings versus like we do with our Zoom accounts where we have our default meeting settings, and then there's only a few things you can tweak in the meeting settings itself.
Right, and for example, you can go through here and you can have it set, well, let's edit this. We'll not save the edits, otherwise people might become upset. Rightfully so, if I mess up too much. Let's see what's going on here. All right, there we go. So yeah, you typically what I'll do is, that's why the topic's important. If it's a series, I'll put the series name in here as well as what the individual topic is for the individual webinar. Date, time works very similar to what you would have with a meeting. You can require registration. I don't think, with meetings you can do that as well, I think now. Didn't used to be able to. But registration, you can do some interesting things with that as far as the types of questions you can ask and so forth. And then you can also have a webinar password if you want. If you don't want the panelists to be able to do video, you can actually turn that off. Otherwise, panelists by default get their video. I can't really think of an application where you would want them to not have video unless they're there basically to talk and, you know, sort of an audio only kind of thing.
Or maybe the person who's doing the screen share needs to be a panelist, but you don't necessarily need to see their face.
Yeah, true. I generally just leave this alone because people can, you know, then call in if they want and at least listen. Also, if they're having audio trouble, gives them the option to come in and continue. That's actually saved us once or twice because we've had situations where people's computer decided that, you know, Mr. Microphone's not going to work today. So they were able to call into the webinar and do the audio through their phone. Options here, you'll see that you have Q&A. You can actually do it without a, you know, and that's actually come up. People just didn't want to do a Q&A because they were doing a presentation and they decided that if any questions came up, they just were going to have them roll through on the chat. And I guess because they didn't anticipate very many questions. But yeah, I mean, that worked out pretty well for them.
Or maybe if you don't have enough people to monitor, one the Q&A and one the chat, just put them all in one place.
Right. And let's see. You can have it so that only authenticated users can come in. So your audience is only going to be Antioch people who are logged in. Then you would check that. Can't say that that's ever come up, but it's an option. Enable practice session. I always enable practice session because you always want to do a practice session prior to a webinar. Terry will tell you whenever you have, you know, because she's dealing with presenters who have never presented or have presented before, but not with us. And so, you know, it's a different sort of thing, you know, than maybe WebEx or something else, whatever they're used to using, you know, Google Meet, whatever the case might be. So, yeah, we always have a practice session. I generally schedule that for an hour, and that's where you sit down and figure out who's going to do what and what roles people are going to fill. I've had situations where we do one session and we're done. In fact, that's usually the case the vast majority of the time. I've also gone through multiple practice sessions with people. We have a graduation ceremony coming up here on Saturday, and we'll be doing our third session coming up for practice sessions this coming, yeah, I think tomorrow actually. Anyway, no, Tuesday. Got to keep these straight. Alternative host, this is where you put in your co-hosts. So, and I don't think there's any kind of limit on that, and it works very similar to what you have with meetings. And yeah, you can do language interpretation. So if you want to enable that, and then and as I say, that's never actually come up as an issue, but you have a variety of languages you can put in there, I suppose. So. And yeah, so that's the basic settings. And then once you click save, then you can go in and look at the different settings that you have down here at the bottom. So for example, if you want to have some sort of, like a different email contact, or you wanted to do something different with follow-up emails for attendees, you can do that. Confirmation emails for registrants. If you decided to enable registration, there's that portion, and let's go over here to invitations. And you'll notice here, we've got 8 registrants. You can actually look here. And they decided that they wanted to have it set up so that you had to be approved to attend. So you would go here, you would see the list of people who were pending, and then you would approve or deny depending upon what your criteria are. Once people have been approved, then you would see them on the list here. As far as what does a registration look like? So you get a registration link that you can send out, and then when that person gets, clicks that link, they go to a registration page. It's going to look very similar to this one. We can, the topic is going to be whatever the topic of the webinar is. It's going to give the time. We can actually add graphics and other things here as well. I mean, it just, this is the sort of generic look, but we can, we can add people, like organizational logos. I've added that. Changed this to say, something a little different. You see here, we've asked for first name, last name, email address, and then we've also asked for additional questions. You're not restricted to just first name, last name, email address. You can put in a, you can ask for other things as well. There's a list of, like, and I'll show you that momentarily. Yeah, so with this, there's where the link is. And then let's see if I click that. Yeah, you'll see that you can go in and you can manually approve people. You can have them automatically approved. You can send a notification to the host when someone registers. So if you don't know if people are actually getting your getting registrations, or if you're getting registrations for your event, he said, you can have it send emails. Typically what I do though, I don't check that box. If you've scheduled a webinar and you're kind of curious how many people have registered for this darn thing, then you contact me, and then I can give you actually not just how many people have registered, I can give you the list of people who've registered as well. You can close registration after the event date. I don't know why you wouldn't, unless you wanted people to be able to view something later, but I don't know how that would work. You can restrict the number of registrants. Let's say that you want to restrict it to 50 people for some reason, then you can restrict it. Let me check the box here. Yes.
Quick question.
Yes.
If you don't check that box, will it still cut off when it reaches the 500 limit for the webinars, or will it allow registration beyond that?
Correct. It won't allow people to register beyond that.
Okay, thank you.
You can allow attendees to join from multiple devices. Typically, to do that, again, you have the people who have the audio trouble. Social share buttons on registration page. I don't turn that off. We've never had anyone who really wanted to share things via social media, or at least that's not come up as an issue yet, but I could see where it might. If you wanted to track people who visit the site, or see your advertisement, and there's actually an ability to do that. So, but yeah, those are the things that you can change. And as far as the questions go, and I didn't show you that, did I? Like that. Yeah, questions. There are certain things that are defaults that are mandatory, but you can ask for address, city, country, zip, state, phone, other things as well. You can make certain fields required or not required. You can even add custom questions, and you saw some examples of those earlier. The one thing that they do say is you are prohibited from soliciting confidential personal information such as credit card information or social security numbers in your registration questions. Now, as I understand it, Zoom has the capability through a third-party vendor of some sort to actually allow you to have people pay for registering for a webinar. But we've never actually done that here. But so if you're interested in that sort of thing, let me know and then we'll explore that. But because it is a capability of the system. But yeah, this is where typically you would ask your open-ended sorts of questions. Polls. We haven't created a poll for this one. We probably won't. But as far as poll questions go, you can ask a variety of different sorts of questions there. What you would expect for a polling situation. Let's say you wanted to know, when the people who actually attended, it's like, are they K through 12 teachers? Are they higher ed teachers? Are they people who are homeschooling children? Are they, what's the demographic of your attendees? You can ask a quick poll like that, or you can ask like what is like knowledge questions prior to the webinar, then ask those similar sorts of questions after the webinar, see if there was actual learning that took place or if people were paying attention. There is a setting here for Q&A. Data, but yeah, there's some things you can change here. What else? Live streaming. You can live stream via YouTube. You can live stream via Facebook. And if you need to do those things, we can coordinate that. And I think that's pretty much all I needed to cover. Oh, and if you wanted to add, for adding additional panelists, that's where I do that here. And for them, I need at least a name and an email address. If you just send me the email address, then I'm going to be like, unless it's obvious from the email. I've had to Google a couple. They came up, fortunately. But I may come back at you and say, can I have a name?
So the participants can obviously just be guests and not Antioch users. Can panelists be outside people who do not have an Antioch email account?
Correct. In fact, when you're adding people to a webinar who are outside the organization, this is where you're going to do it. As far as panelists go.
Panelists, but outside people can sign up and attend. No problem.
Right. If you had someone who was an outside person that you wanted to be a co-host, you can't really do that initially. You have to assign them as a panelist, and then once you get to the webinar, you can then promote them to co-host.
Okay.
So, and you can send an invitation to everybody who is going to be a panelist. That's a nice feature, because then I don't have to separately email them all. It just sends something out automatically. That's that. So questions about all of that?
Ooh. Can you go back to the Q&A and some of the options that were there?
Yeah.
I'm interested in the bottom, attendees can upvote and attendees can comment. What would that look like?
Well, if you were in, as I understand it, let's go back to here. Yeah, this is where you would change that. So you would click, like all, allow attendees to view, and you would all questions, and then you can you can allow the attendees to upvote or to comment on the questions. So if you did allow them to see all the questions, that's pending questions and then also answered questions. If you had pending questions, they could decide which ones, what does the crowd want to have an answer to, and so that's why you would enable that. As far as commenting, I suppose that would come into play if someone gave an answer to something that was asked in the Q&A and people wanted to compliment them on the answer, or to say, could you clarify what that means? Or you mentioned that there was an email that someone could send things to. Could you give us that email? It allows people to sort of ask follow-ups.
Great, thanks.
Sure. Other questions? Silence. You've all been enlightened. This is good. Maybe.
All right, we can probably stop the recording.
Okay.